Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Lobe den Herren, den mächtigen König der Herren. I feel like I butchered that one, but it translates to Praise the Lord, the mighty King of Honor. This is a pretty short chorale, but it does have its moments that make it kind of interesting. I mean, not only is it just a short chorale real estate-wise, but it's also in 3/4 time, which means that there's just 75% less content per measure than what we're used to seeing. But we're going to get right through this chorale pretty quickly today. So, no key signature. We start on C major. We end on C major. I reckon we're in the key of C major. Our first tonic triad takes us to another tonic triad, C, E, G, and C. We don't need to reanalyze. And then we get B, D, G, and G. That's G major over B. That is a 5/6 chord. That is our dominant and first inversion. We then go directly back to another C major triad, C, C, G, and E. That's our tonic and root position. And then we have some notes off of the harmonic rhythm. When all the notes move, typically something is happening, some type of, in this case it's not really a subdivision, more so than it is like a displacement. Instead of quarter note, we have dotted quarter, and the note that would have happened, or the chord that would have happened on beat 2 got shifted ahead a little bit. But regardless, we have another G major triad in first inversion, B, G, G, and D, which is 5/6. We then have A, C, F sharp, and C. That is F sharp diminished over A. This F sharp is the leading tone to G, so this is the secondary leading tone. And this diminished chord would be 7/6 of 5, because G, just like we saw, is our 5 chord. And that goes where we would expect it, G, G, D, and B, which is our 5 chord. And if you look at this progression, this is a roundabout way of, if we were thinking in terms of G major, this would be a 1-6-7-6-1 progression, which is a very common progression in the chorales. This progression of taking a tonic triad between in root position and first inversion on either end of the progression and separating it with the first inversion diminished 7th chord, or just a diminished triad. We then go to G major again, G, 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 and D, so we don't need to reanalyze, even though the third of the chord, oh no, sorry, the B is still there, so we don't need to reanalyze or even really talk about it. This A is a delayed passing tone, though, before we get F natural, D, G, and G. This is kind of an interesting chord because it is a thirdless G7 chord, so the figured bass for that would be 7 because it's now a 7 chord, 6 because if we spell it up from the bass, F, G, B, and D, F to it's a 7th chord, so F to D would be our 6th, and then F to B would be our 4. Am I messing that up? I think the figured bass would be 7-6-2 because this is a thirdless 7 chord. If we spell it up from the bass, let's see, F, G, B, and D. F to D is a 6th. F to G would be a 4. And F to G would be a 2. So we have the F to the G, and we have the F to the D, which is the 6. So we have the 6 and we have the 2. And we know that it's a 7 chord. Granted, I guess 6-2 would also imply that it's a 7 chord, but I'm going to leave the 7 in there regardless. Okay, sorry for stammering there. I had to think through the appropriate figured bass to attribute this 7 chord with. We have C, E, C, G, and C, which is a tonic triad. First inversion. This is where we would expect a 5/7 chord to resolve when the 7th is in the bass. And then we have D, F, B, and D. This is B diminished over D, or 7/6, and we would expect this to resolve to a tonic triad in root position, which it does, C, C, G, and E, our tonic triad. 1-6-7-6-1 is like the way that this chord progression is also operating just in terms of the dominant. 5-6-7-6 of 5-5. 1-6-7-6-1. And then we have a bit of, I think it's called an escape tone. I always forget, I really do need to look that up, but it doesn't really matter too much. What matters is that this is not a chord tone, and I'll mark it because of it. We then have G, D, G, and D, another one of these open fifths. Still gonna write 5 there because we know it's being implied. And then when the resolution goes downwards in all of the voices, we get a 7th, we get the 3rd of the chord, and we get the root, so a fully voiced 7 chord, before our perfect authentic cadence at the end of the phrase leads us to C major, C, G, E, and C, which is our tonic triad. Now, the first part of the second system, at least the way that I formatted the score, is probably the most interesting, because the first cadence we have here is what I'm calling an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor, but I think you could also call this a supertonic cadence. I haven't heard this terminology used anywhere, but it doesn't really feel like... I think there's an argument to be made that we haven't fully modulated, because really what this feels like is a tonicization occurring at the same time as a cadence, and I think some people would argue that the cadence is what, it's sort of like the final nail, final nail in the coffin's a little too morbid, but like the final step that you need in order to really solidify a key. Like once you cadence in a key, or once you see a cadential progression in a key, that's enough for you to say that you are in the new key. But because the cadence happens right after the modulation, I don't think there's enough procedure in place for it to really feel like we've changed keys, especially because I think we revert back to C major immediately afterwards. But for the sake of fitting the cadential narrative that the textbook teaches us and using vocabulary that is universal, we have C, E, G, and E. That's another tonic triad. And I'm going to rewrite that because we're in a new system, and when we have a new line, I reiterate, even though the same chord is at the end of the previous system. We then get E, E, G, and E. You could say this is a rootless tonic triad in first inversion, or you could say that it's some type of E minor triad. And I think, the way that the analysis is working here, I think this is a 3 chord in the key of C major, but I also think that it's a 2 chord in the key of a D minor, and it's interesting because we don't have B to contextualize what quality of triad it is. If it were B flat, this would definitely be a 2 chord, 2 diminished in the key of D minor, but this could just be a harmonization of the melodic minor scale where B just isn't present, and we can just assume that it would be natural if it were present. So I'm just going to write this as 2 here, and it kind of gets turned into 2-7 on the and of the beat because we get D as well, but this E and this G, those are just reiterated tones before we get A, E, C sharp, and E. The C sharp didn't print. This is a 5 chord. And the C sharp here is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it before we get D minor, D, D, A, and F, our tonic triad. The reason why I feel like this chord is significant because immediately after this imperfect authentic cadence, that's how I chose to analyze it. But I mean, if you were still analyzing this in the key of C, you could still say that this was a 3 chord. You could say that this was 5 of 2, and then we cadence on 2, and we just stay in the key of C major throughout. But I don't really know of cadences that, I don't really know of vocabulary that exists to describe cadences on anything other than 1 or 5, or tonic or dominant functioning chords. So it's interesting when we see chords like this, we see subdominant cadences from time to time as well. I've talked about them in length in past videos. Maybe we just need a broadened vocabulary to incorporate cadences that include chords that aren't tonic or dominant. I would definitely advocate for that. But we get another interesting chord here. We have A, E, A, and E, another one of these open fifths. In this case, we have an open third, and the fifth is what we needed to contextualize whether or not it was our dominant, our mediant in C major, or whether it was a minor supertonic in D minor, or if it was a diminished supertonic in D minor. Here we have just an A open fifth. And what I think is being implied here, especially having been preceded one chord before its previous as A major, I think 5 is being implied here, but with the absence of the third, I think this androgynous chord could also be seen in the key of C major as 6. And I think that's interesting because the fact that we're seeing it used twice in close proximity brings attention to it. I think Bach is being clever here. He knows that if you omit the third in certain contexts, or if you omit the fifth in certain contexts, it means that the chord doesn't really have an assigned function. And the benefit to that is that it can be repurposed without needing the third for like voice leading purposes or anything. I mean, Bach probably could have, he definitely could have worked the third into this chord to tell us what quality it was, but he opted out of it until we see the C on the next note that occurs in the tenor. But regardless, we have G, E, A, and E, which would be like another one of these chords right here, where we have an open fifth with a seventh on top of it. So the same figured bass would be implied here, not 7-4-2, but rather 7-6-2, because it is a seventh chord and there is no third in the chord. So the fact that the chord is, or this particular structure is being seen twice seems significant to me. But this C is a chord tone. This is where we get it fully realized. We get A, which is just another redundant tone. And this F right here messes with it a little bit. It's like we get a passing 4 chord with the G in the bass, but because the G is in the bass, I think that this is more contrapuntal than anything else. Not an analyzable chord by Bach's tonal standards. And then after this 6-4-2 chord resolves down by step to F, B, D, and G with a passing tone in the tenor. That would be G7, a fully voiced G7 chord in third inversion, so this would be 5-4-2. And that resolves like we would expect to a C major chord in first inversion, E, G, C, and G, 1-6. This D and this F right here, they are sort of delayed passing tones, but I think they ultimately contribute to what's happening on this chord right here. I guess technically speaking, you could say that we have E, D, G, and G, which would be E minor in root position, but I think this F and this D right here are our chord tones. In this case, it would be D, B, G, and F, which would be G7 over D, which would be a 5-4-3 chord. 5-7 in second inversion. And then we get C, C, G, and E, which is our tonic triad in root position, before we cadence on G, B, G, and D, which is our 5 chord, making this a half cadence, and the fifth of the chord is in the melody, which is a typical hallmark of half cadences. Not all of them, but the majority of them. And the Bach chorales have half cadences consist of a 5 chord with the fifth of the chord in the melody. And as we look ahead, our final cadence is a perfect authentic cadence, and we stay in the key of C major. So we get another G major chord here, G, B, D, and G. We then have F, D, D, and A with a neighbor tone in the bass. That's D minor in first inversion, so 6-2. This is a transitive progression. Typically 2 goes to 5, but if 2 can go to 5, you could use that same voice leading in reverse to get to 2 just as smoothly as 2 went to 5. So that's what I call a transitive progression, because it's a two-way street. You can go in either direction. I'm not sure if that term has been used anywhere else, but that's the term that makes sense to me. We then have F, G, D, and B. Another 5-4-2 chord. We've seen a lot of third inversion 5-7 chords in this chorale, like a disproportionate amount than what we're used to seeing. This D is kind of like turning the chord into second inversion. We get rid of the seventh, and then we get D, G, D, and B, which is like saying a G major triad in second inversion, but I think these two notes are just enclosing where the bass is actually resolving to, which is on the next beat, which is C major over E, E, G, G, and C, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. It's where all of our 5-4-2 chords have, or 5-7 chords in third inversion have resolved. This one here, this one here, and this one here. Okay, looking ahead to like the cadential zone, we have B, G, G, and D. That's G major over B. It's a 5-6 chord. We then have C, G, G, and E. That's C major in root position. That's where we would expect a 5-6 chord to go. This F is a non-chord tone. This C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have G, C, G, and D. I think what's being implied here is a 5 chord, but this C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. It resolves down by step. On the next beat, the bass leaps down an octave, and then we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C, our tonic triad, in root position like we would expect. But that is today's analysis. I spent a long time trying to figure out the figured bass for this particular voicing here, but I'm glad that it got used twice. All in all, maybe the 7th doesn't need to be there, but it's kind of just reiterating what's already being implied. Actually, the more I think about it, it doesn't need to be there. I'm going to go ahead and erase it now in hindsight, the fact that the 7 doesn't need to be there, because the 7th would imply that the outer interval of the chord that's being voiced up from the bass is a 7th, and what it actually is a 6th, because F to, well, in this case, F to G is, well, it's actually a 9th, which is just the 2nd that we were talking about, but we only get a 6 or a 2nd, which is F to G, and then F to D, which would be our 6th. We don't have the 4 in there, so I'm going to get rid of that 7 and just write 6-2. And I think we've encountered this before in the past, and I only wrote 6-2. I was just confusing it in my brain. So strike from the record what I said earlier in the video about needing the 7th in there because it contextualizes the chord. That's not the case now that I've thought about it. But again, pretty quirky chorale, especially with these androgynous triads or 7th chords, however you want to look at them, going on here. I think it's kind of crafty. I mean, the fact that Bach is using them as devices to shift the context from one key to the next without using the tone, keeping it keeping the situation like aloof for his benefit, because if you just have the notes that the two context chords have in common, then the chord can function in either way, and I think that that's pretty cool. I don't think this is the first time that we've seen this, but I'm not thinking of any chorales that no chorales I'm really thinking ring a bell in terms of having them in such close proximity to one another and being used as deliberately as they seem. But I'm going to cap the video off with that. Thank you so much for watching this video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification icon. I upload once a day, and if you'd like your daily fix of Bach or your daily fix of analysis, or both, you're in the right place. Again, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.